They stayed up there when he walked out. So they can't put my PowerPoint up right now. And so they're trying to find Dan and get that turned off so it'll throw up these images. So, but I don't want to lose all of our time together. Thank you for coming out on such a cold and wet night. I appreciate that very much. And it's been quite a weather pattern every week or 2 weeks. It's going to be interesting to see, what happens. I work by telemedicine from my house, and my office is in the front part of the house. And so I actually came down a little after 4 o'clock this morning and started working, and I sat there most of the day looking out the front window, and it just never stopped raining. And so I don't know what else is coming, but they say it is. And so I hope we'll all be safe over the next few days. Kevin was hoping to be here tonight, and he wanted to answer some questions at the end of class, but he's not able to be with us, and he asked me to let you know that he's sorry that he had to be away. And so we'll get those questions answered, though, as we move forward with the rest of the class. I was doing my daily Bible reading, and some of you may have recently, if you're going kind of straight through or following a chronological plan of reading, you may have already read through the book of Genesis. And when you read through the book of Genesis, I feel like you can't help but be touched if you're looking for the personal things that are mentioned there. And I would encourage you to read the last few chapters of Genesis and just look for the personal aspects of Jacob and his concern about where he would be buried. What's that? Oh, it is up? Do I need to back it off? And oh. Okay. Do I need to come out?
Yeah, just hit that.
Okay. My play's over here. Okay. I hit the auditorium earlier. There we go. And then up here we're play. Thank you. Yes, sir. And so I was touched when I read it about where he wanted to be buried, how he wanted his son to fulfill his wishes, how he talked about, what it meant to him when his wife died. And, and I can just hear those conversations not only through the Bible and feel what is being expressed, but from where I've led support groups for the grieving in the past. I've heard people talk in wonderful ways about their mates. I've also heard them say, and it surprises some people, but the reason why they want to remarry is because they had such a good relationship, they want to enjoy that again if they can with someone else. They know it won't be exactly the same it was with the person that's gone. But when my dad wanted to talk to me about that, I said, Dad, that's your choice. And I think it's a compliment to Mom if you want to have and enjoy another relationship like that. Dad really wanted to enjoy someone that could cook brown beans and cornbread and cut up an onion. But so he never got very far with that. But I would encourage you to read the end of Genesis and just look those last few chapters at the personal aspects of it. And you can see that what we're trying to talk about in this class is not something novel or apart from the Bible. There's content there about it. Now, I don't know, anyone in here read the book Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose? It's about the Lewis and Clark expedition. And one of my favorite stories out of the book is about when the Lewis and Clark expedition gets to the headwaters of the Columbia River, and everything they knew based on what they had seen in maps was that it was going to be a pretty easy move from that vantage point to get to the Pacific Ocean. So it's an exciting time. They're setting up camp, and either Lewis or Clark walks up on a bluff and looks out west and is shocked by what he sees, because what he sees are the Rocky Mountains. And all of a sudden he realized that some of the most arduous part of their journey lies before them. And so that is true with us. When we get to certain points in our lives and we're thrown an unexpected curve. And so when I think about Lewis and Clark, it's just a different perspective. Maps that weren't accurate compared to actually standing on a bluff and looking out west and seeing the Rocky Mountains. And so what I'm trying to do in my part of this class is to give you different perspectives. And you have your own perspectives based on your life experiences and things that maybe you've already put into place in terms of planning. And I'm not trying to persuade you to change that, but I just want us to be able to see the different perspectives that are there. And so last week we spent a good bit of time toward the end of the class talking about the choice that you have on advanced directives to say whether or not you want to have CPR. And we talked about how that some studies suggest that, it's 95%. Some people get all of their understanding from watching TV shows. And it's different. This is the last slide that I had up last week. When all of a sudden you find yourself in an emergency room and you're being told things that you don't want to hear, and then you're asking questions, and the emergency room physician is trying to answer those at what is the most critical time in a person's life. And they're trying to make major decisions at that point. We think about it chronically, perhaps at the end of life after a good number of years being lived, but when I was at the Hermitage Church of Christ as a youth minister, we got a call in the middle of the day one day, and they wanted me to run over to the Donaldson Hospital, if you remember where that was. And I ran over and was introduced to parents of a 16-year-old son, and he had tried to swerve his car and missed one of those metal plates they put over the road when they're doing some road work. And when he tried to miss it, he hit some gravel, and his car slid across the berm of the road, and he went sideways with all that speed into a telephone pole. And it threw him across the front seat as the car collapsed around the pole and hit his head, had major trauma. And they came in and talked to the family about decisions they were going to have to make. And I can remember them talking about organ donation. And the mother asking the doctor the question about that, and she said, I just don't think I could handle that. And her perception was that she was going to walk into Target one day and see someone with her son's eyes, and she would immediately recognize them. And that's not what would have happened, but that was one aspect of organ donation she just could not tolerate considering. And so it's hard to talk about these things and to consider options, but it's important. Now, one of the things I love about the end of Genesis is you just have a huge section where it says that Jacob blesses his children. And a number of years ago, John Smalley and Gary Trent co-wrote a book that you may have read if you read that type of family literature, but they wrote from a scriptural perspective based on their understanding, and the book was entitled The Blessing. And they were looking at these passages like at the end of Genesis in the Old Testament, and they were talking about the value of doing that with your children. And so even though our children are in their middle 30s, Faith and I are doing some changes in our estate plan currently, and one of the things that we've been asked to do is to write letters to our children and to talk to them about the legacy that we hope that they will have caught through their own study and prayer and life with the Lord, and things that we want to encourage them to do, and hopefully some of what they caught from us or were taught from us. And so that's a rare opportunity to do that. Anybody in here know a gentleman that was a railroad engineer in this area named Jimmy Hooper? Jimmy used to drive the train, down toward Columbia. I don't remember the name of the small town, and then where he'd turn around and come back. But I think he did that, 4 or 5 days a week. And Jimmy was just one of the neatest men. I walked into church one Sunday morning, and he said, "Guess where I went yesterday?" And I said, "Where?" And he said, "I went to my 75th high school reunion." So he lived well into his 90s. He had outlived 2 wives that were Christian women, and he was married to a third. And he was in the hospital around Valentine's Day. I walked in to see him downtown, and Jimmy looked at me. He was on the phone when I walked in, and he was trying to make arrangements with the florist that could bring his wife a dozen arranged red roses and give them to her. And this is his third wife. He's in his 90s, and he's just a romantic. And when he got off the phone, I said, "Jimmy," "that's going to be hard for them to do, because on Valentine's Day they have so many deliveries, and for them to, you to find a florist that can be here right at this time with those flowers." I said, "That's going to be challenging." I said, "Where are you trying to get the flowers?" And he told me where he's getting not only the flowers for his wife, but his 2 daughters and his 2 granddaughters. And I said, "Well," to deliver them where you want them to go, that's great. But I said, "I'll go and pick up the flowers for your wife, and I'll get them down here early, because you'll know what time that she's coming." And so I did that. I called 4 television stations in town, and 3 out of the 4 showed up to catch this on video and to tell Jimmy's story. And it was really neat. But what I didn't expect to happen was, just a short time after that, Jimmy said, "I want to turn off the machines." And his impression was that once he said unplug them or whatever, that boom, he'd go. And so before he'd allow them to unplug it, he called Carl McKelvey in, who'd been the preacher for 30, 40 years at Vultee. He called me in. He called a nephew in that was very close to him, his 2 daughters, mates, and his granddaughters. And this is one of the first times I've ever seen someone sit down and do what Jacob did with his sons. And Jimmy called each person in his family up to his bedside, and he was blessed that he had the mental capacity to do this. And they sat down on the side of the bed, and Jimmy blessed each one of them and told them hopes that he had for them, and what he appreciated about them, and why he loved them. And eventually he called me up there. And I went over and I sat beside him, and he said, "Gary," he said, "I would have loved to have walked those dusty roads that Jesus walked." And I just listened to him. And he encouraged me to want to go and to be in heaven as well. And it was just one of the most phenomenal experiences I've ever had in my life. But then you stop and say, "Okay, now have I done that with my kids? Have I sat down with them and told them?" Because, there's a chance something could happen acutely on top of a chronic illness. I never have a chance to say goodbye even. And so, I think it's important to read those passages about blessings and to think about ways that you can give them. We sat down with our children and grandchildren last year on a trip to Florida, and we spent each night talking about their parents and us, talking to the children about how we became Christians, why we became Christians, what our influences were in our life, and trying to paint that story for them. And some of them are so young, they won't remember all that, but we're trying to lay that foundation. And so with what we're talking about here, it all plays in together. Nothing more important than the spiritual foundation. and being ready for when we go to meet Jesus or when he comes to meet us. But we want to do that. And I imagine a number of you probably have funeral plans made, and maybe you've already decided, who you want to do it and how you want it done and where you're going to be buried and that type thing. I remember Willard Collins introducing Batsell Barrett Baxter near the end of his life, and Brother Collins said, Ruth, and my plot is right by Batsells and Wanda's. And he said, and the reason why I decided to do that, we've been close friends all of our lives, but when the Lord comes again and those graves are opened, he said, I know I can just reach up and grab Batsell's coattail and just ride it to heaven. And it'd be nice, if you could do that. But it's important to put those things in place. You maybe have done this in your own life, and I've done it with people, and they'll say, I've never done this before in my life. I've never planned a funeral. So I meet them and I go back with them. And I've come to really appreciate a couple of men here in town that own funeral homes, and they don't do it like some of the bigger funeral homes do it. But they're very open and honest with people. They help people when they can. They tell them what the difference is or is not between a concrete vault and a steel vault, and that type thing. And they don't high pressure sell them into something they may not need, but they honor people's requests when they have them. But it's interesting just to think about all the things that happen as we get older and we consider that might need to be done. So when you think about the advance directives, one of the first choices you have to make about a wish for treatment is about CPR. The next thing you have to do is to think about not just, let me get past some of this. All right, so next part of it is quality or permanent conditions. Okay, so if you become unable to remember, understand, or make decisions, if you do not recognize loved ones or cannot have a clear conversation with them, do you want to be kept alive by artificial means or not? And that's a big question to be answered because you're talking about your quality of life. And when you think about your quality of life, you'll be making decisions about permanent unconscious conditions. If you become totally unaware of people or surroundings with little chance of ever waking up from the coma that you're in, do you want to be kept alive by artificial means or not? And then permanent confusion, so being unable to remember, understand, or make decisions, do not recognize loved ones, or cannot have a clear conversation with them. So something happens in your life, and all of us, it seems, are experiencing more people we know that have dementia or, changes like that in their lives as people live longer. And, what happens then? What do you want? And that's what the advance directives let you do. They let you choose that. And then what if you're dependent on others in all activities of living? If you no longer can talk or communicate clearly, you can no longer move, ambulate, get from one place to another on your own. If you depend on others for feeding, bathing, dressing, and walking, if rehabilitation or any other restoration treatment will not help you progress or to have a better quality of life, what do you want done? Do you want to cease treatment when you can no longer function, or do you want to continue to have that type of life-prolonging treatment? And then it's asking you to say yes or no about what you want to do with regard to end-stage illnesses. And when you have an illness that has reached its final stages in spite of full treatment, what do you want to do? If you have widespread cancer that continues to spread through your body and no longer responds to treatment, do you want to keep being put on the next trial that comes up, and do you still want to, that's the way you want to live the rest of your life, going from one treatment phase to another treatment phase, and sometimes being pretty sick on most days? Or if you're no longer responsive to treatment, you have chronic or damaged heart and lungs where oxygen's needed most of the time and activities are limited due to the feeling of suffocation. You know, do you want to be kept alive by artificial means or not? And so then, you know, we've talked about the CPR outcomes already. Now, when you go down through this, you know, one of the things you're going to be asked about is life support and artificial support. And so do you want continuous use of a breathing machine to keep you alive? Do you want IV fluids that may or may not improve quality of life but may lengthen your life for a little period of time? Do you want to be hooked up to other equipment that helps the lungs, heart, kidneys, or other organs to continue to work? And so those are important questions, but they're asking you on an advanced directives form to make a decision about that. Yes, I want that, or no, I don't. And then, what about treatment of a new condition? You know, people often will revoke hospice. They'll have surgeries done to try to address some new condition. They'll have multiple blood transfusions. They'll have antibiotics that'll deal with a new condition, but not necessarily help with their main illness. So what would your decision be in a situation like that? Because in advanced directives will ask you to say, yes, I want that intervention, or no, I don't. And then a big one that's hard. Because we live in the South and we equate feeding someone with love. But the advanced directives form asks you about what your decision is when you're talking about yourself. What would you want done? Would I want tube feeding, or would I want IV fluids? And that's talking about using tubes to deliver food and water to a patient's stomach, or use of IV fluids into a vein, which would include artificially delivered nutrition and hydration. And so it wasn't Shakespeare that said it, but it's a question that possibly you or I will ask at one point. To feed or not to feed? That's the question. And it's a tough question. The American Association of Hospice and Palliative Medicine issued a statement about artificial nutrition and hydration near the end of life about 8.5 years ago. And here's what they felt like as doctors and people that serve folks at the end of life, what they needed to know. Artificial nutrition was originally developed for support of the acutely ill. And at the end of life, it's not likely to prolong life. It potentially can and often does lead to some medical complications. And it can increase suffering. And you might stop and think, well, now, how's that the case? You know, because all you're doing is giving someone some food, you know, through a tube, either into their stomach or into a vein of their body, and you're just trying to, you know, give them some nutrition. And our concern is that, you know, they're going to lie there and we're just going to let them starve to death, or they're going to feel all this hunger and we're not going to do anything to intervene. And these are questions that, you know, you or I can answer for ourselves, so our family members don't have to make those decisions. But one of the things that I found out, and I can remember one of the first times that I treated someone in their home, and they were having trouble with artificial nutrition, and they kept getting pneumonia. And I was trying to figure out, how do they get pneumonia from artificial nutrition from a tube in their stomach? How do they reflux food back up to their mouth and then swallow it, and it goes down the wrong tube and enters their lungs, and then they get pneumonia? How's that happen? Well, it happens because when you're putting stuff directly into the stomach like that, if they're getting too much, or if their body's not processing it like they did when they were younger and healthier, then that can build up and slowly move up that tract and get into your mouth, and it's a horrible thing that happens. It can increase some swelling or edema in the chest cavity. And then there's pressure that's put on the lungs, and so it can increase difficulty in breathing. And what we're thinking about when we're talking about our loved ones, and maybe they haven't made that decision for themselves, sometimes people are saying, no, we can't do that. We don't want them to suffer. And it may be that through the artificial nutrition and hydration, we're creating some of those issues. There was a study of 288 people, average age of 65 years, that were on artificial nutrition and hydration. 30% of those people were on it because they'd had a stroke. 14% had neurodegenerative disorders in their body. 20% had head and neck cancer. And then 34% were a mixture of other diagnoses. And after 3 months on the artificial nutrition, and we're talking about at the end of life, we're not talking about an intervention that may give time for healing, and we're talking about at the end of life, after 3 months on artificial nutrition, end of life, 38% were in a skilled nursing facility or nursing home. 20% had choose to have it withdrawn from them after trying it for an extended period of time. A number of them had impaired ability to do the activities of daily living, and so they weren't able to get up and move around and change positions on their own in bed. And so what happened was they got what we used to call bed sores, and now more commonly referred to as decubitus ulcers. And 24% of them had at least one episode of pneumonia. And so we think we're doing something good for a person, and it depends on what we're doing with the intent of doing something good, where it leads. And it'll be different with every person. And so there was a study done of surrogate decision makers, people that have been appointed as agents of health care for people with chronic illnesses. And they talked to these 246 people that were in that role. And the conclusion of the study was that the majority of these people were saying, we need more information and more physician involvement, talking to us, telling us about the realities and what we need to know about care for someone at the end of life. And so when life is limited by advanced illness, people may lose the ability to eat and drink, and that's kind of a natural progress. We think that as that's happening, we got to do something to stop and turn that around often. They may just lose interest in eating or drinking, in food and fluids. And so when that happens, you need to think about what you're doing. And so should you request artificial nutrition and hydration when there are no prospects for you recovering from the underlying illness, when appreciable benefits may not be achieved? And what I've learned by interacting with people is not that I tell them what to do. I do a lot of listening. And I hear people come in that have really widely ranging perspectives on this. And sometimes their perspectives and thoughts are so strong, they don't have the ability to hear what their loved ones say. And I just want to encourage you to think about, if you decide to do advanced directives, or if you have them right now, to think about the meaning with as full an understanding as possible of what your decisions mean. And then they need to be communicated clearly to your loved ones. And so, what is your loved one's clinical circumstances? You know, we've been called in the hospital after someone was found on the floor with a cerebral hemorrhage. They didn't know if she hemorrhaged and then fell on the floor, or if she fell and hit her head and then had the brain bleed. But she couldn't make decisions for herself. And we didn't make those decisions, but we watched parents, aunts, and uncles make those decisions. And what is your loved one's goal of care? And your children or grandchildren or whoever's your caregiver or healthcare agent, they won't know that unless you tell them. Now, for the acutely ill, this is why it was developed, that when an illness is reversible, sure, someone may need and want that artificial nutrition for a period of time. In chronic disease management, when a person can actually benefit from the treatment without disproportionate burdens occurring in their life, it's a good thing for them to do. But sometimes there are less invasive treatments. We get concerned about someone being thirsty. And there are other things you can do, like ice chips or provision of good mouth care. And I remember, even though my mother didn't have an advanced directive, I remember doing this in the latter stages of her battle with metastatic cancer. And just sitting by her bed and every so often moistening her lips and, cleaning out her mouth and trying to help her have the best feeling she could have at that time. If you have total parenteral nutrition given to you, not just a tube in your stomach, but if you have that given to you anytime, and they tell you this every time you get a shot, but if you're like me, you probably just downplay it and say, no, give me the shot, But there's a risk of infection. And there's a risk with putting nutrition in that way and having a port or something that's permanent, just like a port that you have to have cancer treated. You can get an infection, you can become septic. With tube feeding, what I've already mentioned, you can have aspiration, but you can also, because of all those fluids being pumped in your body, end up having a lot of diarrhea. And then you're immobile, and you're having diarrhea, and you have skin breakdown, and then, I went into a home one time, and this is just true. They wanted me to examine this wound on a person, and when I gently rolled the person over, I promise you I could have put my arm all the way up to my elbow in that person's body cavity because they had done things to preserve his life, but he sure didn't have a quality of life. And so it's important if you can make those decisions for yourself and communicate those to your family. And so, what happens sometimes, people get really agitated and confused at the end of life, and you walk in and people are around the bed and they're trying to work on your loved one. You say, what happened? They say, well, they got really agitated last night and they pulled this tube out or they pulled that tube out. And then they're talking about, do we need to do something? And a lot of rules against this, but how do you make them to where they can't do that to themselves? And a lot of rules about physical restraints and how they're used. And so, respectful and informed discussions about artificial nutrition and hydration before a person gets close to death is the best time to try to make decisions about that. Not when someone approaches you about that suddenly and they can't eat and swallow anymore and they're asking you to make that decision for your loved one or your parent, let's say, or your mate. Those are hard decisions to make. But if I make those in advance and I tell Faith what they are, and this is what I want, and I tell my children this is what I want, and this is why, and answer their questions, then hopefully they'll respect my wishes about that. And so if you have discussions about it, they need to be with adequate information for decision making. They need to be clear about what medical interventions continue even if artificial nutrition and hydration are not initiated. And so hopefully loved ones will realize why you made the decisions you did. And hopefully you can tell them, and if someone needs to guide you through this, you can tell them it legally, ethically, spiritually. You know, I feel like I can accept treatment, or I can make a choice to forego treatment, specific medical interventions. And so people of faith are going to differ about a person's and a family's values, beliefs, and culture should be respected. And what we need is good communication, being able to talk about and have conversations about matters that are difficult. And when we think about clear and measurable endpoints that should be determined in the care that we receive, it may be that you'd say, I want a trial with this treatment for 2 months. And at the end of that 2 months, I want to know, am I progressing, am I still, or am I regressing? And depending on what's happening, these are the decisions I want to be implemented about that. And then there's part 3 to an advance directive, and that's where you express in writing if you want palliative care, if you want hospice, maybe how you want your funeral services done, who you want to arrange them, what you want said or not said, burial arrangements. You communicate that to others. You can do that in an advance directive. And then you can talk about organ donation. And there's a wide variety of choices. I just learned recently that my mother's only sibling that is living is donating her body to science. So she's giving all of her tissues for whatever study needs to be done. And I imagine she's going to do that to the University of Charlottesville, Virginia, in Charlottesville Medical School. So she's going to give her entire body. Or you can just say, I want to give, because I have good kidneys, I want to give my kidneys. Or because they tell me my lungs are in great shape, I want to give my lungs. And so you can say only the following organs or tissues. Or you can just say, no, I don't want to do that. And so those are types of decisions, that you're asked to make on an advance directive. So what questions might you have about things we've been talking about the last 2 weeks, about how to plan for end of life, how to communicate your decisions?
I have a question. Did I hear you say that the person that you designate to make these advance directive decisions cannot be a beneficiary?
Cannot be, that's right. Yes, sir. And so we all heard my dad make his decisions and all, but he made them. And so all he said to us when he got that point in life is he said, put my decisions in place. And we gave the written document to the providers, and that's what they did. But and I think that's just an ethical type of thing they're doing, that when they say, I want you to be the healthcare agent, they're not wanting someone that's designated that knows that when something happens to that person, I'm getting 50% of his estate or her estate. And so that's why they suggest that. But I can bring a little more information about that next week.
Decisions for yourself,
Uh-huh.
then that's not an issue.
That's right. It's not an issue because you're saying in advance, this is what I want done. And then, but I'll tell you, it can't, I've been in situations where everything's in place, it's written, it's in the patient's chart, and they're starting to follow it, and a relative comes in from out of town and just wants to turn over the whole apple cart. And then you have to try to stop and go for a walk with them, listen to their heart, and just do a lot of listening, and then say, but now, this is what your mother said. And sometimes that works, sometimes people want to fight about it. And it's their relationships that suffer. But I hope that whatever fate says in her directives, that I'll respect and implement. It's not up to me and what I want. It's what she wanted. What other questions? Yes, sir, Frank.
So Gary, I have
Yes, sir.
It destroyed the siblings' relationships, and they just never could come back together, and there's just nothing there. So the siblings, the offspring, it just split the family.
Yes, sir.
Because of a disagreement on health care.
Yeah, and that can easily happen. Just like it can happen over selling the farm, and what's the minimum we'll take, or what's the right thing to do, and who's going to make that decision, and how's that going to be divided up? But when you talk about a person's life, that's really different. But the thing that if I do that in advance, and I tell my children in advance, that doesn't mean they still won't have those feelings. My dad did not want to be tube fed. He didn't want artificial nutrition and hydration. And after just a day or two in that situation, my little sister came and said, "Can I talk to you?" And I said, "Sure." And she'd heard Dad make those decisions just like I had, and I wasn't in the medical field at that point. He died a few weeks before I, started going to Vanderbilt. But I said, this is what Dad wanted. That's why we're doing it. He said, "Put my decisions in place." And so we respected it, but that didn't mean that each of the three children didn't have different thoughts about it. But we did what Dad wanted to do. What other questions might you have?
On the slide before, I think you had palliative care and hospice.
Yes, sir.
Almost like that was an option. I see it as, every time I've seen it, it's like complete angels of mercy. Is there an optional question?
It is just a space with, blanks where you can say, "These are my decisions." So you can put it on there and say, "I want hospice." Mom had metastatic cancer, tough. Her sister took care of her, the one that's, making some decisions now down in Charlottesville. But I didn't even know what hospice was, when my mother was dying at the early 1990s. But now that I do, I definitely would want to be kept comfortable. Yeah.
Is there a reason not to?
It just sometimes people don't know. It's just like people that go all the way to Texas for cancer treatment, and they don't realize that right down at Centennial Hospital, Tennessee Oncology has the same trials available right here that can be done. But there's a lot of marketing and stuff about Florida cancer centers and all this, and so there are sometimes just we don't know what that is. And we all know people, though, it seems, that we hear were referred to hospice and then they were gone 3 days later. And so it scares us. But the reason that happens is we haven't been educated about these matters, and we don't make those decisions ourselves. And then, it just treatment's not withdrawn until the very last minute, and then boom, And so, but if I don't want life-sustaining treatment, I want a better quality of life, and I want to be able to talk with my kids and not be sick all day and visit. And that, what a blessing that the government said, "Hey, you got that right. We're going to put laws into place to allow you to make those decisions." Yes, sir. I know the bell's rung, so I'm not trying to keep you in here too long. But if you have questions tonight, happy to answer them. But then when Kevin is teaching next Wednesday, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions about any of this too. And he can get more explicit from a legal standpoint. I'm telling you what I understand. And I'm sure there are people that have been appointed as agents of healthcare or surrogate decision makers. But that's a whole lot easier when that advance directive is in place. Yeah, and okay. Well, thank you all very much for being here tonight, and thank you for letting me teach. And if you have any questions you want to ask me privately, feel free to do so. Doc, how you doing tonight?